Three women at a seaside resort whispered, "You'll remember this night forever," and I never forgot a single moment. The first time I saw the resort, I felt like I had stepped into a painting. The sunlight glinted off the turquoise waves, and the soft hum of distant laughter floated across the air. I had arrived for a short vacation, hoping for a few days of quiet and escape from the usual humdrum of life. But I hadn't expected to notice the people around me with such keen attention, not the way I would later remember them, their presence lingering like a subtle melody. It was by the pool lounge that I saw them. Three women, clearly acquainted, sharing a private joke. Each of them was in their early 40s, but their confidence and quiet elegance made them feel timeless. One had a calm composure, her posture perfect yet unforced, as if she had carried herself like that for decades without effort. Another laughed freely, a sound that seemed to pull at the edges of the afternoon, and the third moved with a serene grace, her eyes scanning the horizon before finally settling on something, or perhaps someone, else. I couldn't help but notice small details. The way sunlight caught their hair, illuminating strands in amber and gold. The faint scent of perfume mingling with the salty breeze, a fragrance both inviting and impossibly distant. Their laughter occasionally brushed against me, though I was careful not to intrude. And yet, in some fleeting moments, their eyes met mine, and it felt like the world had tilted slightly, if only for a second. As I carried my bag past them toward my room, one of the women, perhaps the most reserved of the three, gave me a glance that lingered just long enough to make my chest tighten. There was curiosity there, but also an inscrutable depth, as if she were measuring more than my appearance. The other two noticed, I think, and one of them smiled in that way that made you feel simultaneously welcomed and entirely observed. I wasn't sure what I was feeling, intrigue, admiration, something else entirely, but I knew it was unusual. I found myself walking slower than necessary, stealing glances without any pretense of discretion. The resort itself was a sensory marvel, warm sand underfoot, the gentle slap of waves on the shore, and the faint clink of glasses from the nearby bar. Every sound, every motion, seemed sharper somehow, more vivid, as though the presence of these women had intensified everything around me. Even the sunlight seemed to linger on their skin, highlighting the elegance in a way that felt almost cinematic. By the time I reached my room, I was unreasonably aware of their absence. The echo of laughter, the soft sway of hair in the breeze, and the quiet way one of them had turned her head to watch me leave, they lingered in my mind, refusing to dissipate. I had expected a relaxing vacation, perhaps a few quiet hours reading by the ocean. Instead, I had been drawn into an invisible current of attention, subtle and tantalizing, that promised the night ahead would be unlike anything I had anticipated. And though I didn't know it yet, I would indeed remember this first sighting forever. The afternoon sunlight had softened by the time I found myself wandering near the resort's small garden terrace, a quiet spot tucked away from the pool's chatter. It was there that our paths finally crossed in a way that felt intentional rather than coincidental. One of the women had dropped a folded travel magazine, its pages fluttering in the warm breeze, and without thinking, I bent down to pick it up. Her eyes lifted toward me, and there was that same subtle spark I'd glimpsed earlier. "Thank you," she said, her voice calm but carrying a warmth that made me hesitate a beat longer than necessary. When I handed the magazine back, our fingers brushed briefly. It wasn't dramatic or overly intimate, but it was enough to send a shiver through my awareness. I realized, with a slightly embarrassed start, that I was acutely conscious of her presence, and the way the afternoon sun fell across her face made her expression seem almost ethereal. "You're staying at the resort too?" she asked, tilting her head slightly, a hint of curiosity dancing in her eyes. I nodded, and before I knew it, our conversation had taken on a life of its own. We spoke first of the ordinary things, weather, the charm of the resort, favorite spots nearby, but it quickly deepened, naturally, as if the silence between our words carried as much meaning as the sentences themselves. The other two women joined us shortly after, drawn in by laughter and shared recognition. Their presence wasn't overwhelming, instead, it felt harmonious, like three melodies weaving around a single chord. The three of them had a quiet chemistry among themselves, but also an openness that made me feel unexpectedly included, as though the barriers of age and experience were softened by mutual curiosity. Every gesture, every laugh, every glance was laden with subtle intensity. One of them brushed a strand of hair from her face, and I noticed the delicate curve of her wrist and the faint scent of something floral that clung to her skin. When she laughed, her hand came to her chest in a small, instinctive movement, and I felt the warmth of it long after her voice had faded into the terrace's gentle breeze. Even the way they shifted in their chairs, slightly leaning in toward each other or toward me, created a sense of closeness without words, an intimacy that was entirely nonverbal yet undeniable. I found myself talking more openly than I usually did with strangers, and in turn, they shared glimpses of themselves that felt sincere, unguarded. A passing remark about travel memories, a quiet confession about a favorite book, or an amused teasing about my cautious approach to vacation life, all of it built a fragile bridge between us, delicate yet promising. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of apricot and rose, I realized that something had shifted. It wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't loud, but it was significant. A connection had formed, soft yet undeniable, built from laughter, fleeting touches, and the unspoken curiosity of two lives intersecting. I left the terrace that day carrying more than a sense of belonging. I carried the first stirrings of something I couldn't yet name, something that would linger in my thoughts long after the sun had disappeared behind the horizon. That evening, the resort seemed to take on a different rhythm. The sun had sunk low, leaving trails of pink and gold across the horizon, and the gentle lap of waves against the shore carried a soothing cadence. The three women had invited me to join them for a walk along the resort's private beach, and though I hesitated at first, uncertain if I belonged in their circle, I found myself saying yes. The sand was cool beneath our feet, and with every step, I noticed how naturally our movements fell into sync. The women moved with a quiet assurance, their laughter mixing with the rhythmic sound of the ocean, and I found myself leaning just slightly toward their warmth without realizing it. Every so often, our arms brushed, brief, accidental touches, but they lingered in my awareness far longer than the contact itself. Our conversation began lightly, touching on favorite destinations and curious local traditions, but it gradually deepened. One of them spoke of a past disappointment, softly, almost tentatively, and I listened with more attention than I usually afforded strangers. There was no need to offer solutions or advice, just hearing her voice, steady yet vulnerable, created a bond that felt tangible. Another spoke of a dream she had shelved years ago, and I felt a quiet pull to acknowledge the courage it took to admit it aloud. What struck me most was the way they allowed space for silence. In those pauses, there was electricity, shared glances, the soft brush of hair against shoulders, the subtle alignment of our steps. I became acutely aware of their presence in the simplest, most human ways, the warmth radiating from their bodies, the faint scent of sunscreen and perfume mingling with the salty breeze, the way one of them tucked her hair behind her ear with a graceful, almost unconscious gesture. At one point, the tallest of the three bent down to examine a small shell, and my hand hovered near hers as if to point it out. Our fingers brushed briefly, a momentary spark that lingered longer in my mind than physically possible. I caught myself smiling at the subtle intimacy of it, an unspoken understanding passing between us in silence. As the sky shifted to deeper shades of indigo, their laughter softened, turning into quiet, reflective murmurs. I realized that beneath the easy charm and light teasing, there was a depth I hadn't anticipated. They were confident, yes, but also quietly vulnerable, each revealing layers of themselves carefully, almost hesitantly. And I felt privileged to be there, trusted to witness fragments of their inner worlds. By the time we returned to the resort's lantern-lit pathways, the tension between us had grown, but it was not heavy or uncomfortable. Instead, it was electric in a delicate, almost imperceptible way, in the lingering glance, the shared smile, the brief touch on an arm. It was the kind of tension that promises more, but demands patience, a quiet invitation to look closer, to notice every small gesture and unspoken word. That night, I lay awake, replaying our walk over and over. The cool sand beneath our feet, the salty air, the warmth of their presence beside me, it all felt vivid, real, and impossibly magnetic. I didn't know where it would lead, but I knew with certainty that something profound had begun. Something subtle, something patient, and something I couldn't stop thinking about. The next evening, the resort had a softer, more intimate energy. Lanterns glowed along the walkways, their amber light reflecting on the gentle ripples of the ocean. The three women had invited me to join them for drinks on the terrace, a quiet corner overlooking the beach, shielded from the bustle of the main resort. As I approached, I noticed the way the light softened their features, giving their expressions a warmth that seemed to reach out and pull me in. Conversation began casually, as it always did, but gradually it took on a quieter, more personal tone. One of the women, the most reserved of the trio, began speaking about a heartbreak she had experienced years ago. Her voice was calm, almost steady, yet there was a trace of something fragile beneath the surface. I listened closely, careful not to interrupt, aware that every pause in her story held as much meaning as the words themselves. I offered a simple gesture of comfort, a hand lightly brushing hers as she spoke, a brief touch meant to communicate empathy. The contact was fleeting, yet I felt the gravity of it, the warmth of her skin, the subtle pulse beneath her fingertips, the way her hand rested against mine for just a heartbeat longer than necessary. It was the first time our connection felt less like casual curiosity, and more like genuine understanding. The second woman followed, revealing a dream she had shelved years ago, an aspiration she had once cherished but had set aside for practical reasons. Her voice carried a hint of regret, softened by a wry smile that masked the depth of longing beneath. I found myself admiring not only her courage, but the way she spoke honestly without seeking validation. As she spoke, her shoulder brushed mine lightly, a small, unintentional gesture that made my chest tighten and my thoughts scatter briefly. Even the third woman shared a quiet, almost wistful reflection about a life choice that had shaped her in unexpected ways. The conversation shifted naturally between them, yet I was aware of my own role in their circle, not as an intruder, but as someone trusted enough to be present in these intimate moments. Every laugh that came after a confession, every shared glance, every gentle touch of hands or elbows carried an unspoken weight that deepened the evening's emotional resonance. The night air was cool against our skin, carrying the scent of salt and the faint sweetness of distant flowers. The waves whispered a gentle accompaniment to our conversation, as if the ocean itself recognized the significance of these moments. I became aware of the subtle synchrony of our breathing, the quiet ease with which we shared space, and the way our proximity created a tension that was as tender as it was electric. By the time the terrace had emptied and the lanterns dimmed, I realized how profoundly connected I felt to them, not through grand gestures, but through trust, shared vulnerability, and the courage to be quietly seen. That night, their presence left an indelible impression on me, the warmth of a hand held briefly, the soft cadence of their voices, the way they leaned slightly closer in moments of intimacy. I knew, even then, that these shared vulnerabilities had deepened the unspoken bond between us, laying the foundation for something both delicate and unforgettable. By the time the 5th day of my stay arrived, the resort had taken on a kind of intimate familiarity. I knew the pathways, the soft rhythm of the waves, the quiet corners where the sunset lingered longest. But the presence of the three women transformed even familiar spaces into something extraordinary. That evening, they suggested stargazing on a secluded part of the beach, a stretch of sand where lanterns were absent, leaving only the moonlight and the glittering constellations above. We walked together, our steps light and unevenly synchronized, the sand shifting softly beneath our feet. I noticed how naturally our proximity shifted, how each of them seemed aware of personal space yet unafraid to lean slightly closer when the conversation or shared laughter allowed it. Even the smallest touches, a brushing of a hand when pointing to a star, the brief press of a shoulder as we laughed at an inside joke, carried more weight than I could have anticipated. As night deepened, our conversation became more personal, more teasing, yet underscored by a quiet seriousness. One of them gently remarked on my reserved nature, her tone playful but knowing. I responded honestly, sharing something I rarely admitted aloud, and felt her eyes linger on mine. That pause, longer than normal, was filled with subtle electricity, the unspoken recognition of mutual curiosity, the acknowledgement of a connection that was as emotional as it was physical. The second woman nudged me gently when I hesitated over a remark, her fingers brushing mine. The contact was almost accidental, yet it lingered in my awareness. My pulse quickened, not from desire, but from the intimacy inherent in a shared moment that required no words. The quiet brush of skin, the warmth of a body near mine, the way moonlight highlighted their expressions, all of it felt suspended in time. Even silence became a conversation. We stopped walking for a moment to admire a cluster of shooting stars. I felt the warmth of shoulders pressed lightly together, the shared stillness amplifying the tension between us. There was no need for confession or bold gestures. The longing existed in glances that held, smiles that lingered, and the way each of them subtly adjusted closer, closing the gap between us in the most delicate of ways. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of salt and the faint perfume each woman wore. I became aware of how each moment of closeness, elbow grazing, shoulder brushing, fingers briefly meeting, was a silent dialogue, expressing trust, curiosity, and a tentative attraction. It was the kind of tension that made every heartbeat feel amplified, every glance significant, every pause pregnant with meaning. By the time we returned to the resort, the subtle electricity had not dissipated. It lingered in my chest, in the memory of the gentle touches, in the warmth of proximity, and in the quiet, knowing smiles that required no explanation. The night had drawn us closer, emotionally and physically, but it had done so gently, carefully, a slow, deliberate layering of intimacy that promised more, but demanded patience. I went to bed that night aware that the connection had grown deeper, richer, and infinitely more compelling. It wasn't loud or rushed, it was a quiet tension that promised a future night, a conversation, a touch, that I would remember forever. The night air was thick with anticipation as we wandered along the beach, the soft glow of the moon reflecting on the rippling water. That evening had a different rhythm, lighter, freer, yet charged with an invisible current of tension. The three women had suggested a playful challenge, racing to a set of dunes at the far end of the beach. What began as laughter and teasing quickly evolved into an unexpectedly intimate moment of closeness. I stumbled slightly in the sand, and one of them reached out instinctively, her hand brushing against my arm. The contact was fleeting, almost casual, yet the warmth that lingered after she pulled away was undeniable. The other two women circled closer, their presence enveloping me in a sense of ease and subtle exhilaration. Every movement, every glance, every shared laugh carried a weight far beyond the playful surface. When we reached the dunes, we collapsed onto the soft sand, laughing and gasping for breath. Our shoulders pressed together in natural alignment, our knees occasionally brushing, and I became acutely aware of the quiet intimacy in these small, unintentional touches. It wasn't bold or overt, it was the kind of closeness that lingers in memory, a shoulder against mine, a hand resting lightly on the sand beside me, a shared glance that holds longer than necessary. As the laughter settled, the conversation turned quieter, more reflective. One of them spoke of a fear she had carried for years, another shared a personal regret, and the third admitted a dream she had long abandoned. I listened, offering what I could, a comforting word, a steady gaze, a hand that found theirs briefly before retreating. In that moment, the boundaries between us felt less defined, the age difference less significant, and the emotional connection undeniable. The ocean whispered its familiar cadence in the background, the night air cool against our skin, and the moonlight cast soft shadows that seemed to stretch and mingle around us. Every small gesture, the gentle brush of fingers, the leaning in during a pause in conversation, the warmth radiating from their shoulders, amplified the tension, deepened the bond, and made the evening feel suspended in time. At one point, we fell silent, watching the horizon as the first hints of dawn began to appear. Their shoulders were close enough to touch, their heads angled slightly toward mine, and I realized how profoundly I had come to care for them, not just as companions, but as individuals whose presence stirred something quietly powerful within me. I felt their trust, their vulnerability, their subtle attention, and it wrapped around me like a comforting weight. By the time we finally rose to leave, the connection between us had crystallized. It was not a rush of passion, nor a dramatic confession. It was something steadier, deeper, and infinitely more compelling. The night had woven an unspoken understanding between us, a tapestry of shared laughter, gentle touches, lingering glances, and heartfelt conversations. That moment, on the moonlit dunes, was the peak of our emotional intimacy, a quiet climax that promised more to come but required only patience, presence, and care. Even as we walked back toward the resort, I carried that night with me in every sense, the warmth of their proximity, the weight of trust, and the profound, unspoken connection that would remain etched in my memory forever. The final night at the resort arrived with a quiet inevitability, carrying a bittersweet weight. The soft hum of the ocean, the gentle sway of palm fronds, and the distant clink of glasses created a serene backdrop, one that made every step feel slower, every glance more meaningful. I knew that tomorrow I would leave, that the brief chapter we had shared would end, yet tonight felt infinite, suspended in a delicate balance between anticipation and farewell. The three women invited me once more to the terrace, where lanterns cast pools of warm light across the stone floor. We lingered, talking less and observing more, the rhythm of shared presence now more comfortable, more intimate than ever. There was a quiet confidence in their gestures, the way one leaned slightly closer when laughing, the subtle brush of a hand against my arm as she passed a plate of fruit, the gentle tilting of a head that seemed to invite conversation without words. We sat together on the edge of the terrace, legs dangling over the stone railing, letting our feet hover just above the cool night breeze. The ocean murmured below, a steady undertone to the quiet symphony of our shared moments. One of the women reached out instinctively, resting her hand briefly on mine. The warmth was grounding, yet electric, a reminder of the unspoken connection that had threaded through every day of our stay. The other two mirrored the gesture in their own ways, a gentle touch on the shoulder, a casual brushing of knees, a playful nudge that lingered longer than it needed to. For a long moment, we simply watched the stars together, a shared silence that spoke louder than any words could. I felt the subtle pull of proximity, the weight of trust and vulnerability between us. There was no need for declarations or dramatics. Every glance, every soft touch, every faint smile communicated exactly what mattered. The evening felt like a culmination, a quiet celebration of connection, attention, and mutual understanding. As the night drew on, we shared one last toast, the clink of glasses punctuating the culmination of days spent in laughter, conversation, and growing intimacy. Their smiles held something deeper than amusement, an acknowledgement of the bond we had built, the fleeting yet profound nature of our time together. When the moment came to part, the hugs were careful but lingering. Arms slipped around waists, cheeks rested lightly against chests, hands lingered in parting. Each touch carried memory, warmth, and a sense of permanence in impermanence. Walking back to my room afterward, I felt a quiet awe at the depth of what had unfolded. The connection wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was indelible. The shared laughter, the subtle touches, the moments of vulnerability, and the gentle closeness had etched themselves into my memory. I knew I would carry them with me, the warmth of their presence, the soft cadence of their voices, the delicate rhythm of our shared moments. Even now, as I recount the experience, the memory remains vivid. That night, that final evening, was more than a farewell. It was a crystallization of connection, intimacy, and understanding, a moment of beauty that transcended age, distance, and circumstance. And though the resort receded behind me, the quiet truth endured. The three women had given me a night I would remember forever.